Thank you so much for doing this with me.
I'm so happy to meet you and to talk to you.
So I kind of wondered if we could start with the love story that begins with you growing up in Jamaica and how your story becomes woven into this profound account of a young country coming to know itself and it's settling into the heart of your family story. Tell me why Jamaica? Let's start there.
It was impossible to tell my story without also telling the story of Jamaica, and the way that Jamaican history intersects with colonial history, with the history of Rastafari, which is an anti-colonial history. We gained our independence from the UK in 1962, which was the same year both my parents were born. They were born in this whale of rebellion, as I say it, and this shaped them and their lives, and this shaped their futures in such a great way. And it also was something that sharpened the necessity for Rastafari, which is what called my father to it. Because Jamaica was just, newly independent, still figuring out what kind of nation we were going to be, and a lot of the young people at the time were trying to figure out also for themselves, what did freedom look like to them. And to my father, Rastafari was the thing that gave him a sense of selfhood and this sense of a future defined by freedom and Black liberation. And so I thought, okay, the story begins there.
There's words that sound familiar when you use them, and then they sound so unfamiliar. Like one of the themes in American religious history that we hear a lot is in the sometimes binaries between people who will feel like they belong at the center of the story. They are the city on a hill. And then those who feel like they are exiled. And so some of these themes are so immediately apparent in words like Babylon, and and words like Zion. So I wondered, teach me these words in that context.
And these are words that defined my childhood and defined my adolescence. So when the Rastafari movement began in the early 1930s, there was a street preacher, Black street preacher. His name was Leonard Percival Howell. And he heard one of Marcus Garvey's final speeches. And Marcus Garvey, for those of you who don't know, but you should know who Marcus Garvey is, he was an Africanist revolutionary who kind of believed in the repatriation to Africa. And this preacher heard one of his final speeches, and Garvey said, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a Black king, for he shall be the redeemer." And so in the early 1930s, Jamaica was still under British colonial rule, and Black people in Jamaica did not have freedom, they didn't have human rights, they were living in poverty. And this is around the same time that the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, was crowned. He was coronated. And he was the only Black ruler of the world, in the world at the time. And Ethiopia was the only African nation to never be colonized. And so Howell saw Haile Selassie and thought, this is him, this is the Messiah. The movement of Rastafari then hardened around this idea of Haile Selassie as a Black Messiah, as an aspirational figure for Black liberation. But the Jamaican government that was still under British rule did not take kindly to the Rastafari movement. And so the Rastas, once the movement began, they were called a cult, they were treated as outcasts, they were targeted by the army, targeted by the police, they were kicked out of their homes, turned away by their families. They were forbidden from walking along the beach sides that were being developed for tourists. And so the Rastafari in Jamaica historically were persecuted, and they were seen as pariahs, really. And this made the Rastafari turn inward. Everything that they saw that was against them, they called Babylon. They looked to the Bible for these examples of Jewish exile and Jewish strife, and they found that struggle as parallel to what they were going through. And so this is where this Babylon comes from the Bible, from the Psalms 137, where, you know, these people were exiled to Babylon. And they said, you know, our oppressors have us here in Babylon and they ask us to sing songs of Zion. But how can we sing songs of Zion when we are in a strange land?
Yes.
And so, to the Rastafari, like these concepts and these, those stories really made sense to them, to the realities they were living. Yeah. And so I grew up kind of hearing that Babylon was everything that was tied to the outside world, the evils of Western society, capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, racism, ism, and schism. Yes. That's Babylon. And everything that we hoped for, the future that we wanted, this idea of Black freedom and Black hope, that was Zion.
Your book really belongs, in my opinion, in an American religious history survey, because it really taught me about, because I guess one of the other themes that really I didn't have any vocabulary for was the feeling of sacred family too, that when you are cast out, but you're still called to something. Like, where does that live? Where do you go to feel your purpose? Can you tell me the ideals? Like, what would sacred manhood look like in its ideal form?
You know, my father and all the rest of Bridgewood are very concerned with the purity of the body. And they see the body as your temple. And the body is supposed to be fortified against the temptations and the evils of Babylon. And so for, you know, the Rastafari, they eat a vegan diet, what we call vegan, but the Rastas call it Aito, which means you eat no meat, no fish, no dairy. But also in my household, it was also like no salt, no sugar, no MSG. It was like extreme veganism. And, you know, for Rasta women, a lot of those rules were even more intense than they were for the Rasta brethren. So for Rasta women and girls, those rules of purity and the body as a temple extended to wearing modest clothing that covered our arms and our legs. And you could wear no pants, you could only wear skirts and long dresses. Some Rasta women also had to cover their hair. A lot of Rasta brethren also covered their hair. My father wears a tam on his head. If he's going out into the world with people that he does not know, that he thinks are impure, he will cover his dreadlocks with a tam. And also, growing up with dreadlocks is not just like a hairstyle choice. It is very much connected to this idea of the sacred. It's the sacred marker of Rastafari, the way you kind of signal your reverence and devotion to Jah, which is the name of the Godhead figure, Haile Selassie.
One thing that always strikes me as so wild and so familiar is that the people that we love come into faith sometimes by very different paths, and then end up under the same roof, doing sort of similar things. And your parents had very different journeys into the same shared story.
Yes. I think most people outside of Jamaica kind of think of Rastafari as the thing that defines Jamaica.
Totally.
And, you know, Rastas in Jamaica are 1% or less of the population. They're less than a couple 100,000 in Jamaica. And so it is not a normal thing for somebody to choose Rastafari in Jamaica. And my father himself was, he was disowned by his mother, who was a Christian, disowned by his family because he chose Rastafari when he was 17. And so growing up, this had just been my reality, and I never actually asked my parents, how did we get here? And it was luckily in writing the story that I had to ask them, and I sat them down and I asked them, tell me how you got to Rastafari. And then my father, of course, says, well, I and I don't choose Rasta. I and I was born Rasta. You know, and I'm like, okay, but like, how?
And also,
But also,
I like more details about that specifically.
but, like, yes, I understand you were born Rasta, but like, how?
Yeah.
And you know what? His calling to Rastafari, I think, is something that he even now talks about as his life's purpose. My father is a reggae musician. He's a very militant Rasta man. He speaks in this way, in this deep Rasta vernacular. But he grew up fatherless. He grew up, you know, a little bit abandoned in his family. But I think it really started for him in this place of wanting to belong somewhere.
Yes.
And I think Haile Selassie for him really represented the patriarchal figure that he was inspired by, in lieu of a sort of fatherless boy.
Yeah.
But my mother, I mean, she straight up just says, I was a hippie. Like, I was a beach bum. She's like, I would have been a beach bum just smoking on the beach if you weren't born. You know?
I love too that everywhere she goes, she like starts a school.
She does. She really, really does.
She's just like, it sounds like people gather around her.
Her children gather around her like the Pied Piper, but good. You know, like.
I did forget that story ends differently. Yeah.
Yes. And but for her, I think it also began in this place of yearning. She always wanted to be a mother. And when she was 16, American Catholic nun told her she was infertile and she couldn't have children. And she really believed it. And it created such an ache in her that she was searching also for something to believe in or belong to. And in the book, I said she was searching for something or someone. And she kind of met my father, who was this militant Rasta man, and he was like, don't believe what Babylon nun tell you, like, if you want to have a baby, you can have a baby. And she was like, okay. And so I think that kind of solidified her belief in him initially, of where he wanted the family that they both wanted, and the path of righteousness that he intended for us to go on.
Yeah.
So, you know, initially she thought this
Like
is
that
the
miracle
man,
opened
this
a
is the
door.
man who you know, changed my life and gave me the thing I wanted. And so I think they both were two young people, 21 years old, and embarked on this journey.
It's never clear to me exactly when kids know the strangeness of their own family. We all discover it one way or another.
Eventually.
And there's I think always a kind of, I mean, in different ways, but like that secondhand embarrassment of seeing your family through other people's eyes, and then simultaneously like an intense defensiveness and homicidal love. You're like, how dare you? How dare you? They're perfect. You had some really lonely years as in elementary school, and where you kind of had to live in that, in the world, and then in the world your family had made.
You know, for a long time, I thought our life was this kind of idyllic life. We lived in this yard that my siblings and I kind of ran around in. We climbed the trees. We picked all our mangoes and apples and avocados from the trees. And, you know, our mother really also fostered our sense of play and imagination. And she created her own system of education around me and my siblings, which she then imparted to all the other parents in Montego Bay that were like, oh, your children's so bright. Like, how can we, like, get some of it? And she sort of created her school after people started asking. So, you know, there wasn't friction all the time, but I would say that when we grew our dreadlocks, because my siblings and I didn't always have dreadlocks, and there was a moment where my parents decided that we would grow our dreadlocks because we were supposed to be a perfect Rasta family. And my father said, this is what we have to do. As the twig is bent, so the tree inclines, is what he said. I was 8 years old and I never forgot it, because I was like, what does that mean for me, you know? It was a conceptual thing when my parents said, you're gonna grow your dreadlocks. And then when we returned to school
I see.
with the dreadlocks, then it was a reality, and I was like, whoa, I didn't understand what this would mean for me. I might be surprised that my siblings and I were among the first Rasta children to integrate in the public schools in Jamaica. Before that, Rasta children were not allowed to be in schools. And even now in Jamaica, as recently as like last year, the government has now lifted the rule that Rasta boys can go to school without their dreadlocks covered. There was a young girl who went to school one day with dreadlocks. The principal took her into her office and cut all of her hair off without telling her parents. And it became this big legal case in Jamaica. And this was just a few years ago. And so when I got to school, it wasn't just the children. It wasn't just my classmates who would point at us and try to pull on our hair or sing, nasty songs about us. It was also the teachers who treated us badly. And so whenever we left the house, we felt like outcasts. And that was the moment that the friction began, because I felt for the very first time ashamed to be myself. And I wasn't sure why. Nothing about me essentially had changed. It was just now how I looked outwardly.
Thinking about your story, it felt like the temperature just kept going up. And all these choices kept costing your family more and more. And it sounds like the success your father had musically had these moments of like glittering joy for all of you. But it also became combustible because of, so many things that just really like financial betrayal by his colleagues, that it became unsustainably painful in many moments for all of you.
Yes. And again, this is something that when I was growing up and living inside of it, I kind of had no perspective. He was in this popular, I guess what we call a boy band in Jamaica, that would travel around Jamaica, girls screaming, and he was the lead singer.
That's so crazy. That's really cool.
You can actually watch a video of them performing on YouTube, which I didn't know.
Stop.
And then he went to Japan and he recorded an album, and he was touring in Japan, and then his bandmate made a side deal for the royalties and kind of tricked him, and basically the band broke up and everything went bad. I think everything in my family kind of shifted. And so when I was growing up inside of that, it felt that all of these tumultuous things were happening and I didn't quite understand why. And now that I'm outside of it and I'm older and I'm an artist myself, I can, in some ways, understand the disappointment of an artist, the disappointment that my father must have been feeling. Now, he didn't deal with that disappointment well at all, but in many ways, I can feel the hurt of that disappointment. Now that I am older and outside of it.
There's pain in being old enough to know the bitterness of our parents' hopes. And wanting it so much, especially when you're in a moment of, when you're blooming, and you're at the beginning of a real, you bloomed hard. When did you know that your words were so powerful?
I'll say I began to feel that the words that I could conjure, the words I had inside of me, were important after my mother introduced me to poetry, right? And so as part of our education with her, she would always have us memorize and recite poems. And she would do this thing with me in particular, because you might not be able to tell this, but I have a temper. And it was so much worse when I was younger. And whenever I would that, would start to like flare up in these furies, she would just start reciting these poems to me. And one of them she loved was If by Rudyard Kipling. And it was like, if all around us are losing their head, keep your cool. And so she would say this poem over and over to me. And so for her, she had those poems memorized. And then for us, when she read us the poems, we started to memorize them naturally as well. And then I just wanted to do it more. And again, when I was writing the memoir and I was writing all these moments, I was like, my mother made me into a poet. She had me memorize the poems. She gave me the book on prosody. She handed me my first collection of poems.
It's like unlocking all these
Unlocking all the doors. And then she would take us, me and my siblings, on these nature walks through sort of the green and beautiful countryside of Jamaica. And she would point out to me the name of every plant, every flower, every insect. And I would just document. And then I would write my poems about all the trees and plants and flowers that I loved. Yeah. And I call it, in the book, I call it the green language of poetry. Because for me now, my poetry is very much rooted in the lush and Edenic landscape of Jamaica. And it was around 10 where I wrote my first poem. After I had this really painful experience at school where, a young girl I thought was my friend said to me, I don't want to be your friend, I don't want to be friends with the Rasta. And I was so sad, 10 years old, and I harmed myself. And my mother, who, even though I told her a different story about how I'd come to the wound I had, she knew. And she gave me this collection of poems. Yeah. And she said, poetry for me has always been the thing that made my world wide and wild and warmer. And I think I'll do that. And I think it'll do that for you. And then she told me that was alliteration. And I said, what is alliteration?
It is delicious.
And all of the deliciousness as she explained this sort of stuff of poetry. And I read this poem by Blake, The Tiger, and I felt physically, viscerally, the hurt from being outcast by this girl at school leave me. And instead my imagination was filled by all of the imagery and all of, the magic of this poem. And I sat down and I wrote my own little poem, which was like an imitation of the tiger called The Butterfly. And then I knew this is what words can do. And poetry for me was a space of wonder. And I thought, if I can always follow this feeling, this sense of wonder, I'm always going to be okay. And so I guess there was the power. That was the first time.
Good. Yes. That's so good. You saw the little breadcrumb path.
Last week, I saw a bookstore had a beautiful quote
By James Baldwin, who had escaped to Paris to escape so much of the worst of American racism.
and he had a quote about writing that made me think of something you'd written. He said, "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive."
There is like a mystic thing that happens through the eyes of others, which is so odd. Like, it is through the eyes of others that we can even sometimes begin to pull out these parts of ourselves that we realize are universal.
Yes. And that's kind of the magic of literature, right? That it does kind of bridge space and time. That what we feel are our feelings and our emotions and language and beauty as vessels for meaning is really at our essence the most crucial thing we have as human beings.
I wanted to ask you a bit about, there's a really interesting literature about submission and the way that as women, we're not really sure how to frame agency in relationship to templates of surrender. And you had this very early moment in your life when you had to decide if submission was an ideal for you anymore. The like constructive version, which we can see in all kinds of versions, there's all, wonderful literature about, women in Islam, and my areas in conservative Christian women, in which there's a kind of engaged surrender, is that people step into worlds in which they have very little control, and they accept the moments of small possibility, and they find beauty and purpose in that, and we call that choice and agency.
Yes.
And then there's the feeling of the avalanche in which you're being taken over by a set of choices made for you that you can't possibly experience yourself inside of.
Yeah.
And none of that is news to you. You were trying to make these choices all along. But I wondered the moment when you decided that this version of submission was just not, that there was a flame of who you are that would be maybe extinguished by it.
Yes. The first one was when I was around 8 years old. And I remember it was one of the rare gatherings I'd gone to of Rasta people in Montego Bay, because, the Rasta movement scattered apart in the 60s, because the government, there was a commune of thousands of Rasta people who lived in Kingston called Pinnacle. This was Leonard Percival Howell's kind of dream, and they lived there, in unity, and they had their own crops, they had their land, and the army came, still under British rule, the army came and burnt it all down. And after that, the movement really scattered. It was no longer unified. There was no one meeting place. There was no one sort of book or set of tenets that unify Rastas anymore. It divided into 3 separate sects. One that's extremely strict, which is the one my father adhered to the most. Most of what Rastafari looks like now is that the Rasta brethren is sort of the Godhead and the head of the household, and he kind of divides the rules and interprets these different tenets of Rastafari, which is what my father did. And so,
Is it the same as saying the fatherly role and the prophetic role become
yes, the same.
unified?
Exactly. He was sort of the everything in the world and how we understood it had to go through him first.
Yeah.
And it came from his mouth first. My father didn't even want us to be around Rastafari people. He wanted to be the only person who was in charge of our moral architecture. So he didn't even trust them.
Yeah.
But when he was gone to Japan recording his music, we went to this gathering, and I remember there was the Rasta brethren outside. They were eating, they were talking, they had a drum circle, they were sharing their wisdom with each other. They would invite the young boys in to get some of the wisdom. And then the Rasta women were inside, they were in the kitchen, they were making the food and handing the food to the men, and they were minding the young children, and I was like, well, they have no opportunities to share wisdom or reason or invite young women into their circle of wisdom, because they were doing the labor. And so I remember being at 8 being like, okay, this sort of chill came over me, and I was like, this is weird. This is kind of weird. And then I would shook it off and ran outside, And so that was one of the first moments. And then by the time I was 9, my brother and I were super close, and we used to run around the house and do everything together, climb our trees and stuff. And my father came to me one day and he said, "How tall are you, young?" And he kind of measured me next to him. I'd grown tall. And he said, that's it. You're not climbing trees anymore, that's over. Girls don't do that. You're not wearing pants anymore. No daughter of mine is going to be a Jezebel. And he told my mother, throw out all the pants, all the shorts in our house. That's over. And then that was really the moment where I was like, well, this doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
Because there was no rules like this placed on my brother. And I was like, well, why not? That's so unfair. Already, siblings are like, that's unfair. But for me, I was like, no, that's really unfair. I don't think so. And I began to think then,
Yeah.
well, what kind of woman did my father envision me to be? And is that the kind of woman I want to be?
That early outrage feeling of like, am I not yours?
Yeah.
Like, will you really make me into something else right now?
And why?
One of the scenes in your book I found to be so beautiful and emotional is when you decide that your hair is no longer going to be the symbol of your family identity. And I wondered if you feel comfortable, if you could read the moment where set the scene.
Yes, which is, a defining moment in my life and the one we see here on the cover, right? When I decided to cut my dreadlocks, and I'd been asking my whole life, and my mother has said, no, your father would not allow it, he won't allow it. And finally, when I had this vision of myself, and if I followed the path my father had for me, I would be this cowed, silent Rasta woman who was the wife of a Rasta man who had no dreams and no desires. And I said, Mom, I don't think I can do it. I said, Mom, I need your help. And she said, okay, what can I do? And she held up my hair, my dreadlocks. There was hair, so much hair, dead hair, hair of my gone self, wisps of spiderweb hair, old uniform lint hair, pillow sponge and tangerine strings hair. A whole life pulled itself up by my hair, the hair that locked the year I broke my tooth, hair that locked the day we caught cane ashes in the yard. Hair of our little years, hair of the fat, pollen of marigold's hair, my mother's aloe vera hair, my sister's weaving wild ixoras in my hair, the pull of the tides in our sea village hair, grits of sand, hair of salt tears, hair thick with the blood of my own cut wrists. Hair of my binding, hair of my own beautiful wanting, hair of his bitter words, hair of the cruel world, hair roping me to my father's belt, hair wrestling the taunts of bald heads in the street, hair of my lone self, hair wrapped atop the ghost woman in white's hair, red thread of hair, centuries of hair, galloping future of incorrigible hair, all cut away from me. When they were finished, my head and neck were so light they swung unsteady. The tethers had been cut from me, and I was new again, unburdened. Someone different, I told myself. A girl who could choose what happened next.
Oh.
Oh, it sounds like a baptism.
It felt very much like that.
It's to be new. To be new. It's so wild to be new in any way in our lives, and to for you to have to so forcefully start a new chapter.
Yes. And decide this is what I wanted to do, no matter what the consequences were going to be. I was willing to do it.
Yeah.
To get to where I needed to go.
There's such a tenderness in the way that you describe how your mom's love for you and hope for you was not fully borne out in the story she'd lived for herself so far, but she was handing you something that felt like a path, even though she was it, I mean, she couldn't have mapped it exactly. Like she couldn't pick your college or
Yeah.
just knew that there was like a moreness
Yeah.
to you. And it's just,
Right.
but then you had to somehow
Yeah.
absorb enough courage to do something wildly different than seemed. I mean, the world that you're living now is so, required so much courage. And a lot of it sounds like throwing yourself off cliffs and then hoping there would be like a small.
Hoping I could fly. Glad I did.
That's
Glad
right.
I could.
Yes, that's right. You flying squirreled the crap out of that situation.
Not going flying squirrel.
Beautiful, beautiful response.
Be a sparrow.
The peacocks can't fly, so I am restricted. I am restricted in my metaphors.
Yeah. I think, it was just wanting more. Wanting more for myself and wanting better. I looked at my mother and I love her so deeply and so dearly, but I knew she wasn't happy all the time with how,
Yeah,
the shape of our lives.
yeah,
Or the shape of her life also. And I thought, I don't want that path. But the thing that also pushed me is that I'm the eldest of 4, and I have 2 younger sisters. And I was like, well, I don't want the things I'm going through to happen to my sisters.
yeah.
It was something that really, really motivated me. And so I was like, if I can kind of change the path, if I could go this way instead of that way, then they'll have choices too. And so, I just read the passage where I cut my dreadlocks. And after I did that, my middle sister, she cut her dreadlocks. And then my youngest sister, she cut her dreadlocks too and left home. And then my mother, who had been growing her dreadlocks since she was 19 when she met my father, she cut her dreadlocks too. And had this moment of newness again, that she could choose for herself for the very first time what she would make of Esther. Her name is Esther. What she would make of her future.
Yes. Yeah. Ultimately, this is a story about deep forgiveness. What do you think it was that made your love return back to wanting to experience like wholeness with your family?
Yeah, and I think you mean with my father in particular,
Yeah.
right? I say I'm the oldest. I knew him first and loved him the most. And believed always that he could be worthy of love, of my love again. And I'll just say, when I cut my dreadlocks, this was kind of the breaking point between me and my father. He didn't speak to me for a year. We lived in the same house, and he looked through me like I was a ghost. I did not exist to him. I was someone who represented the ruin of his vision for the perfect Rasta family. And he responded with fury and with violence. And this was the point where I felt like I needed to leave Jamaica to survive. I don't think I would have survived it if I had stayed. But there was something in leaving and having that distance and that time to really think about everything that had happened, to think about our story, to think about wanting to write the story. And when I began to think about writing the story 10 years ago, it was not the story I wanted to write, because all of what I was feeling was still too fresh, too wounded. It would have been a story written from a space of hurt, or maybe anger, or maybe even vengeance, and I didn't want to write that story. That's not what I wanted to leave to the world. And so I put the book away. Thankfully, I had a really great professor. His name's Gregory Orr. He was my mentor at UVA, wonderful poet, and he said, you need to write this book from a place of safety. And I don't think you have that yet. And he was right. And it was 5 years later, this was 2018, I went back to Jamaica for the first time. And spoiler alert, also because this is the end of the book. But I went back to Jamaica to read my poetry for the first time. And I invited my father to come and hear me read for the first time. And I read this poem I had written for him. And I said, before I read it, I said, you know, I spoke to him the wish I have always for my poetry and for my words, is that, Father, I just want you to hear me. And I read the poem, and I remember I got off the stage and he embraced me to him, and he looked at me and felt to me for the first time, eye to eye as an equal, and he said, I'm listening, and I hear you. And then this was the moment that I felt so much had been released from me. And I felt I had that place of safety and that I was ready to begin to write this book because I could write it from a place of home.
I cannot tell you what a joy it has been to see you, to hear you become so courageous. What a gift it's been to talk to you tonight. Let us thank what a gorgeous human being. Well done. Beautiful. Thank you so much.